I'm Dr. Finley-Croswhite, and we're on a class field trip online. I'm here today in Elmwood Cemetery in Norfolk, Virginia, and my son, Alex, is the cameraman.
Don't do that.
At any rate, I want to tell you a little bit about the cemetery before we go and look at some specific sites. Elmwood was established in 1853. The reason it was built was that the cemetery right across the way, called Cedar Grove, was filled. There were no more plots. And you know, Norfolk is close to the river, and there were swampy areas downtown where people were burying their dead, and sometimes when we get big rains, bodies would come up and be floating around downtown. And so ultimately the city decided that it had to have a new cemetery. Elmwood was built in the 19th century in conjunction with what's called the Victorian park-like cemetery movement. And the idea was that cemeteries would look like parks where people would want to go. And ultimately, it was quite common on weekends for families to go out and picnic around the tombstones where their loved ones were buried. So it was a way of including those who had passed on in the daily lives of individuals in the 19th century. And that made a whole lot of sense given high mortality rates in the 19th century, before vaccinations and before things like penicillin. Death was so much more common. So we're going to look at some specific instances of death in the 19th century by walking around this particular cemetery. Again, built in 1853. It contains about 40,000 individuals who have been buried here. So that's a significant part of the population. And unless you buy a plot from somebody who already owns a plot, there is no more room today in Elmwood Cemetery. So let's go look at some sites. Okay, before we start talking about individual cases of death in the 19th century, I also want you to note that Elmwood Cemetery is just incredible landscape of 19th century and early 20th century architecture. And the tombstones really had meaning. You're looking here, if you can pan up to the recording angel there. Elmwood Cemetery is filled with angels. There's another one standing right next to me. Just beautiful, beautiful pieces of sculpture. The recording angel, of course, refers to the biblical text where Christians' names were written in the book of life. And so at the end of their lives, assuming their names were there, they would go up to heaven. Remember, in the 19th century, there were very few atheists, and so most of the people buried here were middle and upper class Christians, and they were true believers in what they were taught in their churches. The other thing you would see in a cemetery like this is, look over here, you see an obelisk, and if you pan the landscape there, you'll see several obelisks. Well, in the 19th century, because of Napoleon's conquest of Egypt, obelisks, think of Paris at the Place de Concorde, there's a gigantic obelisk. Obelisks actually became really popular in cemeteries as part of funeral art. You will also see clams here often on the tombstones, and clams engraved, and those are references to Christian pilgrimages dating back to clam was the symbol of pilgrimage dating back to the Middle Ages. You will see obviously crosses, lambs for the Lamb of Christ, often on little children's graves, and hands pointing up, of course, with the great hope of people going to heaven. If you can pan over here, I want to show you this ivy bed. And this is really interesting. You might ask yourself, now why is there a bed of ivy in a cemetery? And in fact, if you turn around and look, there are beds of ivy all over this place. And that's because the ivy bed was meant to be a blanket. It represented a blanket. And so for Christians, the symbolism there is that these people are only sleeping, that at some point they'll be resurrected and go up to heaven. And so the ivy bed was just meant to represent a blanket, and at some point that blanket would be pulled off. So I'm not really here to talk to you about funeral art, but I couldn't miss the opportunity to just point out a few things to you. Okay, as I mentioned, Elmwood was established in 1853. In 1855, Norfolk was unfortunately engulfed in a yellow fever epidemic. that absolutely decimated the city. Norfolk in 1855 had a population of about 14,000. By the end of the epidemic, in the late fall of 1855, Norfolk had 6,000 people left. Most of the people that had lived here had abandoned the city. At least 2,000 people died from the yellow fever epidemic in Norfolk. And so what you find here in the very opening part of the cemetery are lots of tombstones with the dates of summer and fall of 1855. And so we know these people probably died of yellow fever. Because there's a little recording office not too far from here on the cemetery site where there's a card file, you can actually look up individuals' names and find out what they died of. So we also know that there are lots of people buried here who died of yellow fever because of that documentary evidence in the archives here. This is a particularly favorite memorial stone that I like to point out to students. It references Catherine Baylor, and Catherine Baylor was a teacher in the city of Norfolk, and she died of yellow fever in 1855, and in fact all of her children died as well in August and September of 1855. The mother, Catherine, and her 3 daughters all died of yellow fever, and the obelisk was put up by her students in memory of what a great teacher she was. So if we look at some of the dates, if we can try and find the dates on here, Catherine died in September of 1855. If we flip around here, we'll see that the daughter, Elizabeth, died in August 31st of 1855. This other daughter, whose name was Richardetta, died September 6th of 1855. She was only 11 years old. And finally, Alexina died on September 10th of 1855, who was 20 years old. So you see how yellow fever could wipe out an entire family. And if my cameraman will walk with me, if we just walk through this part of the cemetery, if you look at this monument put up to the Sylvester family, and you walk around and look at these dates on here, R.J. Sylvester, born September 29th, hey, that's my birthday, 1828, died September 6th of 1855. So I know for a fact he died of yellow fever because I've pulled his documents. But even if I didn't know that, because it's September of 1855 and because it's in this front part of the graveyard, I could pretty much guess that he was a victim of yellow fever. Yellow fever is a virus that's transferred by mosquitoes, and it leads to a particularly horrible death. People in Norfolk were very vulnerable to it, being a port city with all the standing water around here. You know mosquitoes are bad in Norfolk. And yellow fever wasn't eradicated until the early part of the 20th century, so it was particularly devastating to Norfolk. Yellow fever tends to be more virulent in adult bodies than in children's bodies, and so what happened is the yellow fever epidemic of 1855 left many, many orphans in the city. 1855 isn't that far out from from the Civil War, and so that is decimating to the south as well. What you end up with after the Civil War is that a lot of those orphans have grown up a bit, and a lot of them, especially the females, have become prostitutes. So we'll talk about this in another PowerPoint, specifically about yellow fever, but in many, many ways it damaged the economy of the city. It took away some of the great leaders within the city, and it left this orphan and female population very, very vulnerable. Here we have Dr. Henry Selden. There's a Selden Arch downtown in Norfolk that's tied to his family. He's born November 11th, 1817, and yes, he dies in 1855. And if you look over here on this side, it actually notes that he died nobly at his post of duty in the pestilence of 1855. That pestilence, of course, refers to the yellow fever epidemic. So again, if I think about death in the 19th century, specifically in Norfolk, I'm going to have to talk extensively about how yellow fever decimated the city. Stopping by a family plot that belonged to the Hawthorne family. In a little bit, I'm going to get the camera guy to take some shots of these small baby tombstones. There's at least 5 people buried here, a mother, a father, a daughter, and 2 little infants that died along the way. I know that James Hawthorne, who died in 1889, the records in the archives indicate that he had an accident, that he fell off something and seriously injured himself. Elizabeth, his daughter, died as an adult from what's called la grippe, which would be just basically a bad flu. But the 2 little babies here, we don't know what they died of. The records don't indicate in the archives. But I do like to point them out. You find baby graves throughout this cemetery that in a day and age when most of the kid diseases that you and I got as children, and I either survived or was vaccinated for them, but most all of them you were vaccinated for probably. Before the days of vaccination, it was just very common for families to lose children early on in those first 5 years, when they would get specific diseases like scarlet fever or strep throat or diphtheria, cholera, measles, mumps, those sorts of things that could lead to death. And if there was a significant injury, if someone fell and got a bad laceration and infection set in, there was no penicillin to help beat those bacterial infections. And so life was precarious. And I like to point out these children's tombstones just to indicate the high prevalence of infant and child mortality in the 19th century. So you want to get close up and look at those tombstones? We're in a plot in Elmwood Cemetery that was put up by the Norfolk Seamen's Friends Society. Now, these days, the Norfolk Seamen's Friends Society is pretty much defunct. Because of things like cell phones, seamen in the Port of Norfolk no longer have the needs that they did in the past. But in the 19th century, when people came to Norfolk, and they were from other places, they were from far away, and that was true of sailors, they often had nowhere to go. And so the Norfolk Seamen's Friends Society had put up a house here in the 19th century, and they were really a Christian organization, and they were hoping to convert sailors and seamen into Christians and perhaps change their ways. And certainly this was a kind of public health effort as well, because sailors were feared in port cities because of the various diseases that they could bring in. Well, what's interesting about this particular plot is that from, I have to look at my dates here down on my page, from, 1876 to 1909, this plot was used to bury over 300 seamen who died here in Norfolk. Most died accidentally. And it's historically significant because there's a lot of seamen's graveyards in port cities, but the tombstones were usually made of wood, and so we don't know who's buried there, and they've rotted out by now. But Norfolk Seamen's Friends Society actually used granite, in some cases marble, to put these little markers up. And the markers don't have names on them by and large, a few do, but most just have a number. And again, you can go to the archives and look up the seaman's name. That's significant, and mostly probably find out what he died of. So, most of these men were in their 20s and their 30s. Another reason this graveyard is significant is that sailors, if they died outside of their hometown, wanted to be buried at sea. That was an honorable place to be buried. But when they died in port, they tended to be dumped in potters' fields, where nobody, especially their family members, could ever retrace them. So, a lot of times, sailors with diseases wouldn't go to hospitals because they didn't want to end up dying and be dumped in a potter's field. Once the Norfolk Seamen's Friends Society established this plot, there was a greater likelihood that sick seamen would actually go visit St. Vincent de Paul Hospital, the modern day name is DePaul Hospital down on Granby Street. It wasn't in Granby Street in those days. And that was run by the Catholics, and they would take care of sick seamen. If they died, they'd be buried here in this plot with a number on their marker so their families could eventually have some knowledge about what happened to them. I've pulled all the cards, and interestingly enough, found that many of the people that were buried here died accidentally. Remember, steamships in those days used fire boilers, and it was easy for men to be burned in the process of operating ships. And on big sailing ships, they could get lacerations and whatever that would get infected. Oftentimes they would fall off the mast and do serious damage, killing themselves in the process. Sailors were notorious for drowning. Sailors in the 19th century weren't considered particularly healthy. They were considered real carriers of disease. They didn't eat well, and most of them actually, oddly enough, didn't know how to swim. So a lot of the people that died here died of accidental death. Infectious disease was also a huge problem, and I noted that of 49 seamen who died of infectious disease, there was 18 cases of typhoid fever, 16 died of lung disease, which could have been tuberculosis, 13 died of heart disease, 12 of liver and kidney ailments, 12 of abdominal problems, 9 of dysentery or chronic diarrhea, 8 of peritonitis, 4 died of hemorrhaging, and 2 died of aneurysms, 2 died from cancers, and 18 died from a host of causes that included physical problems like exhaustion, scurvy, chills, tetanus, hepatitis, septicemia, and even alcoholism. There's one seaman that's buried here, and we don't know where, but he actually started a mutiny on his ship, and he ended up killing some people, and he was hanged in the city jail, and then his body was deposited here somewhere in this plot. So if you can follow me over to a tombstone on the other side, we're going to look at it for just a minute. What do you mean 4 minutes? That's all that's left on the card?
That's all that's left on the timer.
What does that mean? Huh?
It means you have 4 minutes before it cuts you off.
Okay, I would just like us to look at this tombstone because it's unusual. Again, in sailors' graveyards, generally the sailors are buried anonymously. And in this one, while we know who's buried where, we have to go in the archives to look it up. But here we actually have one tombstone. It's the tombstone of William Jeffrey Sanders, and he was a young 19-year-old sailor from England who died in Norfolk in 1894. We don't know what inspired an actual tombstone that's so much bigger than the others and actually has an epitaph on it. You know, the tombs of the wealthy here, the stones of the wealthy, are filled with epitaphs that are engravings on the stones that say something about the individual's life. And when you're a sailor, you don't get that. Well, William Jeffrey Sanders inspired, I guess, so much love or respect that in fact he gets an epitaph. And I did a rubbing down here a couple of years ago, and it says, "No kindred near to drop a tear or mark a sailor's grave." And I think that's just emblematic of what it was like to be a sailor in the 19th century. If you died in a foreign port, the chances of there being a record of that would be very slim. So we don't know anything about William Jeffrey Sanders, but he must have been pretty awesome because this stone was put up for him. Now, hi, here I am at the Happer grave plot of the family Happer. This is one of the most poignant places, I think, is in the graveyard. If you follow me back here, you'll see that the Happers had 4 daughters. The first one was born in 1880, Mary Thomas Happer. Florence followed in 1881, Fanny Stewart in 1884, and finally little Pocahontas was born in 1891. Now, We don't know what Florence and Fanny Stewart Happer died of, but clearly they either died at birth or they didn't live very long because they died within the year of their birth. We do know that Mary Thomas Happer lived 4 months and died of infantile cholera, which is a waterborne disease, which brings on horrific diarrhea, and babies can die of it within about 6 hours. So Pocahontas died from tonsillitis. I don't know about you, but I had tonsillitis all the time when I was a kid, and I would end up on penicillin, and eventually I had my tonsils out and I was fine after that. She only lived 8 years. So my point is that the Happers had 4 children and none of them lived to adulthood. 3 of them died the year that they were born, and only little Pocahontas managed to survive for 8 years. That was life for children in the 19th century. In the graveyard. This is an interesting site. Melinda, wife of John Lesnar, who died in 1874. I can't prove it. However, people that have studied this graveyard and know the history of it better than I do tell me that, I mean, obviously this is a white middle-class and upper-class graveyard. There's only 1 African American buried in this graveyard, and apparently it's here somewhere. And it was the maid of the Lesnar family. And apparently the story is they loved her so much that they included her within the graveyard itself. So that's not, please don't think that I'm trying to say that African Americans were beloved by the people that they worked for. That's not my intent at all. I just would like to emphasize that there's only 1 African American buried here in this white graveyard. Okay, here we are in my favorite part of the graveyard. This is the Cook family plot. And if the film guy can scan the horizon here, there are a number of Cook graves. So we're going to start in the back here. The Cooks were a very wealthy family. They owned a mansion at the end of Butte Street, if you happen to be from Norfolk or know about Norfolk. And I've always come here because of this little grave here that's always so sad to me because the cross has fallen off. And the grave just says infant son of Beatrice and M.T. Cook. M.T. stands for Merritt Todd Cook Jr. And that child died in April of 1918. I had gone to the office to look up the card and found that he died at birth because his umbilical cord, there was a knot in it. He lost oxygen in the birth canal and was born stillborn. So again, another example of problems tied to childbirth in the 19th century. For years I've been coming here with my class. Recently, in the archives in downtown Norfolk, I came upon some letters by a woman named Kate Cook, who, interestingly enough, in World War I in 1915, got herself on a boat and sailed to France and became a nurse's aide at the American Hospital in Paris, which has a fascinating history. The day before the World War I began, the American Hospital dignitaries went to the head of the French Army and said, "We're going to open an ambulance here on site." And an ambulance, that meant like a tent hospital at the time. And eventually, with lots of funding from the United States, the American Hospital established an ambulance team made out of Model T Fords. So while the French Army Medical Corps was pulling soldiers by horse and carriage when they were wounded, the Americans actually were able to get wounded soldiers to the American Hospital in Paris in Model Ts. So that's kind of interesting. Well, Kate, a wealthy, aristocratic woman who was quite interested in suffrage, voting rights for women, and as she said, didn't want to just be a mother, ended up going to France and spending 3 years working in the hospital as a nurse, and actually learned anesthesia there and began helping to anesthetize patients before surgeries, which is pretty interesting, I think, given the highly specialized skill of anesthesia today. At any rate, Kate ended up marrying one of her patients and stayed in France. And what always puzzled me is, if you come over here, Kate and her husband Jules, their tombstone is here. And through a long series of work, I was able to get in touch with surviving family members today. Most of the family still lives in France, and technically I'm a French historian, so I was able to talk to people in France and found out that when Kate died, she and her husband wanted their ashes returned here to Norfolk. So he was French, she was from Norfolk. She had a really interesting life fighting for voting rights for women during World War I, not being passive as many Americans were in 1915 and serving as a nurse, and then ultimately wanting her ashes to come back here to Norfolk. That's Kate. Close to the Cook family graveyard is the grave of W.W. Hunter. There's a big article from the Norfolk paper in 1905 about W.W. Hunter. He actually had been the city's treasurer. He was a prominent businessman here, very well respected. But in the course of his life, towards the end of his life, he struggled with insomnia and depression. The article says that he had melancholia, which was the 19th century way of saying he was depressed. And he came out here one day in 1905 and shot himself in this area around noon. Workers heard the shot, didn't think much of it, and when they went back to work, they found his body laying under a tree. He'd shot himself in the head, and he didn't survive. And so, maybe I should just say suicide is not germane to 19th century as some of the things that we've talked about here today are, but has remained a health problem throughout time. But at any rate, I had a student write a paper on W.W. Hunter, so I can't really walk past his grave without thinking about how hard it must have been in the 19th century to struggle with depression when it was so not well understood, and well, I think we can argue today that it's still not very well understood. I'm standing next to the wall that divides Elmwood Cemetery from West Point Cemetery. And this wall is a symbol of segregation. Before 1873, there was no place to bury African Americans in Norfolk, meaning that they ended up being buried in backyards and probably just dumped in places. But in 1873, a city councilman by the name of Fuller was able to get the city to concede that there needed to be an African American cemetery. So this wall divided the whites from the blacks, and if you look at the beautiful tombstones on the left and the density with which people were buried there, and then you look on my right and see the sparsity of the African American burial ground. In fact, I'm told that there are African Americans buried all over the place here, but they don't necessarily have markers. And we talked about the angels all over Elmwood Cemetery. There is one angel in the African American cemetery. Points in this African American graveyard. First of all, you have the one angel here. So if you can pan up and look at the one angel, this is a real testimony to the economic differences between whites and blacks in the 19th and early 20th centuries, obviously before civil rights. And this stone dates to 1917. Okay, looks like there was a picture there at one time that's no longer there. But again, the sparsity of the landscape, if we just consider the landscape, it tells us something about the differences between blacks and whites. Second point I want to make is that there's no African American hospital in the 19th century in Norfolk, and so African Americans did not have good health care. When we look at the records, we know that African Americans suffered particularly from lung diseases, particularly from tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is a bacterial-borne disease, and you can get it by having people cough on you, and because African Americans lived in crowded tenements, that may be one reason. That's not to say that whites didn't get tuberculosis. In fact, one member of the Cook family we were just looking at, one of the wealthiest families in Norfolk, died of tuberculosis in the late 19th century. But tuberculosis was a particularly big problem for African Americans in the 19th century. The last thing I want to do with you is show you just a real gem of a monument we have here in Norfolk. Norfolk was taken over by the Union Army during the Civil War very early. And as a result, many African Americans that lived here in Norfolk were able to join the Union Army They took advantage of the Underground Railroad that was here in Norfolk to flee north. Many of them were able to be emancipated, or they fled this area. And so this monument here in Norfolk was the first monument put up to African Americans who were Union soldiers during the Civil War. And it's the first monument erected to them south of the Mason-Dixon line. So this is a historic area. It's recognized on the National Trust as a result of this particular monument. In 1885, James Fuller, a Norfolk City councilman, had the cemetery name changed from Calvary Cemetery to West Point Cemetery, and he was involved in conceiving the idea of having a monument to African American Union soldiers. The man on top was an individual by the last name of Carney. You've probably heard of him, William Harvey Carney, because he's portrayed in the film Glory, played by Denzel Washington, who fought with a Massachusetts regiment during the Civil War and was a particular hero of a battle in New England. And he was from here. He was born here in Norfolk and was able to leave the South and make his life in the North. The last thing to note is that this graveyard is these tombstones. People buried here are African Americans who fought for the Union during the Civil War or who fought in other wars, particularly the Spanish-American War and World War I. And their tombstones are here. And what's very significant about some of these individuals is that we know that some of them were born here in Norfolk as slaves, and yet they ended their lives as free people. So that concludes my tour of Norfolk graveyards, specifically Elmwood and West Point Cemetery, and there will be an accompanying PowerPoint to go along with this video as well.